Well, good morning. It is good to be back with you for another day of Bible study as we are finishing up our second week here in the book. My name is Kevin Young, and I have the privilege of being lead clergy here at Christ Table. If you'd like to know more about Christ Table, what we do, who we do it for, you can check out that URL right up there in the corner of the screen at www.christstable.today. What we are is a ministry that is here for people who are on the margins of faith, who are on the margins of evangelicalism or Christianity, people who need safe space, maybe because of trauma or because of questions or just because they don't fit in any of the churches in their area. But also we welcome a lot of people who are a part of Christ Table who have other church faith families that they are very committed to, but use us as a secondary resource, and we are thankful for that. When you're over at the website there, christstable.today, sign up for our email list there so that you'll know more about what's going on here. And speaking of going on here, we do these Bible studies that are live in the morning, 4 days a week, throughout most of the year in order to help center you during your week. Research shows that if you spend just a little bit of time practicing and centering yourself on your faith 4 days a week, then it has an incredible payoff in your life. And so that's why we do this. This study is the book. We're spending 7 weeks looking into the Bible, kind of from an outsider perspective, trying to look at things from other views than just religious normative views on these passages. And so you can be a part of this. And if you'd like to be a part of it, that URL right there, go.christstable.today/thebook. You'll find a PDF that has a reading schedule and study schedule for this entire study, as well as a free step-by-step study guide that walks through it absolutely free, no strings attached. You can download that PDF there anytime. And if you would like the printed, nice bound book of this study, you can get that there as well. Just click on the button that says get the box there, and it comes with that and a whole lot of other resources that we pull together and give for free to those who are regular supporters of Christ Table, but you can get just this one. Now, that is a lot of words, so why don't we just go ahead and jump into today's topic. So we've been looking this week at the Hebrew concept of God and trying to see what we might find in the character and the viewpoint and perspective that the Hebrew scriptures, or as Christians sometimes refer to them, the Old Testament, on God. And so we've been spending our times in the Torah, in the Old Testament, but today we're going to actually jump into one passage in the New Testament for our final day in this study, and that is in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, verses 4 through 6, where we're jumping into this letter that the Apostle Paul is writing to a church in the town of Corinth who has well, it's a mess. If you have ever been a part of a church that is a mess, if you have ever known some religious people who were messes, then this is probably the same type of person or the same type of church that was in Corinth. They were passionate, but they also were problematic. And that may well describe all of us who are religious faith in nature, but certainly it describes this church right here. So what we're doing is we're kind of jumping into a long conversation where Paul is just kind of walking through a list of issues and problems, and this was kind of normal for that time period. These churches were kind of overseen by apostles and by people like Paul. And so, there wasn't social media, there wasn't a telephone that could pick up and call. I heard Dolly Parton communicates not by text or by email, but if you want to get a hold of Dolly, you got to send a fax. There were no fax machines back then for communication. There's no Pony Express, no United Postal Service, none of this. So you're going to write letters. It's going to take a long time to get there. And occasionally, maybe every few years, you might make a visit to the place. So it's not as though this church is more problematic maybe than most churches, though some of the things that are here seem to be kind of extraordinary. It's just that whenever you're managing something and you only get to communicate every once in a while, you're going to be working through the questions and the problems that they have. And that's what Paul is working here. And there is a big one that oftentimes kind of gets overlooked because in Corinthians, a lot of the conversation is about sex. And we as human beings are just drawn to conversations about sex like bugs are drawn to those little zappers. That's, I guess, how God wired us, right? So that kind of gets all the attention in this letter to Corinthians. But there's this moment that Paul has in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, verses 4 through 6, where he's in the middle of a broader discussion. But he has a conversation about food. And if there's one thing that is maybe near and dear to my heart, additionally to sex, if I can say that, is food. In fact, sometimes it's hard to tell the difference as to which one is a great love, right? And let's just be honest, we're all kind of creatures of food, and we're creatures of pleasure, and food is pleasure, right? But the religious customs and restrictions from Judaism that so many of these individuals that were coming to Christianity were coming out of were very precise. And they were given through Moses from God himself. And so there's a lot of difficulty surrounding what is right and what is wrong. What do we do? What don't we do? What can we eat? What can we not eat? What can we wear? What can we not wear? Who can we hang out with? Who can we not hang out with? But really the friction point was food, because the table was so central and was so important. So Paul now, with all that set up, is getting into this, and he says, so what about eating meat that has been offered to idols? Many pagan temples, just like the Jewish sacrificial system, would have required and utilized animals and sacrifices in order to appease the god or their gods for whatever that might be. And so that meat then was able to be sold in order to help fund the temple operations to whatever the temple, to whatever the deity was. And so many Christians had multiple issues with doing this. First of all, it's meat that has been sacrificed in honor of some god other than the God that they worship. And then for Christians, beyond that, there were many questions about whether or not they could hang out with the people who were eating those meats, whether or not, that was also offensive to Christ. If it had been offensive in Judaism to God, what about Jesus? And so it kind of seemed as though the best thing to do was to avoid it, because spiritually it seemed the right thing to do and the safe thing to do. But there were some people who said this is not a big deal. And so Paul wades into the argument. Well, what about eating meat that has been offered to idols? Because I know that this is a source of a little bit of headbutting that's going on in your church. I've had headbutting in churches, right? Well, this was theirs. It's hard to imagine. But it was. They apparently didn't have carpet or music to fight over. So, well, we all know that an idol is not really a god, that there is only one God. And so if you were here for yesterday's study, then we've kind of walked through this idea of one God, a monotheistic religion, that there is but one God, and he is jealous and only wants you to serve and to worship him alone. No other idols and no other worship. That's a no-go. If you didn't, then go back to day 7 and feel free to watch that. But what Paul is doing here is Paul is kind of leaning back into that Shema back in Deuteronomy. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord your God is one God, is God alone. There may be, Paul continues in verse 5, so-called gods in heaven and on earth, and some people actually worship many gods and many lords. So Paul says, okay, let's just be honest. There may be other things that call themselves God and heaven and on earth, and some people may actually worship many gods. and many lords. Now, Paul isn't necessarily commenting on whether or not there are other gods, though I think Paul probably had a strong opinion that there was but one true God. But Paul is saying, no matter what you think or what somebody else thinks about these other gods, these so-called gods in heaven and earth, I'm not trying to trigger any of you, Paul says, and some people even actually worship those gods, and that worship may be very fervent, maybe even more fervent than the worship that you give. And maybe they feel as though that provides a great deal of benefit in their lives, the ones who worship those. And maybe it does. Maybe it does provide some sort of benefit to them. And okay, whatever. This exists. But for us, there is one God, the Father, by whom all things were created and for whom we live. And there is one Lord, Jesus Christ, through whom all things were created and through whom we live. And so Paul is going to kind of continue here, and he does this also as well in Romans, and he's going to say essentially, eat freely, drink deeply, if there be no other gods, if all of these other gods are so-called deities and there are no other lords, if there truly is, as the Shema says, as Judaism believes and as Christianity teaches, that there is but one God, then food that is sacrificed to fake gods who don't exist doesn't matter. There's nothing transformational or magical that has happened to that meat. If you happen to accidentally end your prayer with, amen, thanks be to Buddha or Allah or the spaghetti monster God, it's not as though that meat is tainted. Paul is trying to say, I think, a little bit, grow up. This is not something worth arguing over, but he also obviously here and in other places is trying to gently help people to see that there are those who are young in their faith who do not yet fully kind of understand and comprehend the spiritual world and the way that works. And sometimes you just got to give people time. You got to give people time to grow in their knowledge and understanding. And this is something for us all to kind of step back from and say, we might not now today argue over meat that has been sacrificed in honor of other deities and in temples, though in areas of the world this is still a question. But you may not deal with that issue, but you may deal with other things where people who are weaker spiritually, not quite as mature, may still hold to things being taboo, being wrong, being a boundary that should not be crossed. But you, having grown and understood and lived more in the grace and love and the knowledge of your faith, may have long passed that boundary being a problem. And the interesting thing is that the people who are weak spiritually may be the people who present themselves as being the most spiritual folks. It may be the pastors, it may be the small group leaders, it may be the church staff members, it may be the older people in the church or that are maybe should be the most spiritually mature, but they're not. They've never grown. And it may well be that the people who are visually present themselves maybe as being weaker and less knowledgeable, maybe people who don't go to church, maybe people who identify as evangelical, maybe people who are relatively young in their faith or young in their age may be more spiritually mature than people who are old in their age or old in their faith. So it's not so easy to tell sometimes. And Paul says that may cause disagreement. And we need to avoid disagreement over these things and understand that, yeah, this isn't a big deal. Some people are going to think it's a big deal. That doesn't necessarily make it a big deal, but go ahead and give them grace. We can apply that to lots of things. This isn't really a big deal. Some people are going to think it's a big deal. It's not a big deal. They're going to eventually learn that. But in the interim, maybe perhaps try to, as much as is possible, give them some space and give them some margin of grace. And so we can kind of pull back out of this and from this passage about food and about idols and about things that we might participate in that may not be our specific line of thinking theologically, but is okay for us to do because there's nothing really to it. To those with whom we disagree, we can still have unity. To those with whom we disagree, we can still have hospitality. To those with whom we disagree, we can still have kindness. This is why it gets under my skin so much whenever Protestants go to war with Catholics, go to war with Eastern Orthodox, go to war with Muslims, go to war with Buddhists, go to war with Hindus, go to really, Paul and our Christian faith gives us permission and freedom to be ecumenical, to sit across the table, to sit across the pew, to sit across the conversation from those with whom we disagree, especially with the knowledge and the understanding that meat sacrificed to idols, if it really is sacrificed to a so-called God that isn't God, then there is no harm or effect in them doing that. So feel free to be in relationship and eat that meat. Other people who think differently than you, religious-wise, it's okay to sit at their tables and eat meat. It's okay to be involved in their worship services and experiences. It's okay to show hospitality to other people, even if they don't believe the way that you believe or practice the way that you practice. Their idols are not your idols. And frankly, if we really read in the New Testament, the real point of the matter is usually whenever we're more concerned than we should be about other people's idols and problems, it's because we are trying to avoid facing our own. Until next week.